The United States is often hailed as the world's oldest democracy despite it being built on two monumental crimes: the genocide of the Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans. Similarly, in the Middle East, Israel is frequently considered as the bastion of stability and the only democracy in the region, even as it continues to engage in an ongoing occupation, acts of genocide, and apartheid. The irony inherent in these statements is difficult to ignore. So what is India credited for? India is considered to be the world's largest democracy. With a population of over 1.3 billion people, it is known to have the most vibrant and diverse democracy. This episode will unravel the ironic nature of India's democratic and secular ideals and how these are projected on Indian Muslims. Treating minorities fairly is considered a fundamental principle of Indian secularism. Muslims make 14.2% of India's population, that is, 200 million people. But the exclusion of Muslims from politics, their social exclusion, and marginalization cannot be attributed only to their numbers, because even during the long period of Muslim rule in India, they were not the majority. The real issue is in how their political power and autonomy were gradually eroded through pressures on their language, history, culture, and identity. Before discussing overt forms of discrimination, which include pogroms and riots, we will look at systemic and structural forms of marginalization. Such forms of marginalization make minority groups vulnerable and disadvantaged in all aspects. In our case, it's Indian Muslims. How? Let's have a look. In 2005, a committee led by former Chief Justice of the Delhi High Court was tasked with assessing the social, economic, and educational status of Muslims in India. This report was called the Sachar Committee Report, and it provided comparative data of the differences between Muslims and other socio-religious communities in terms of their demographics, education, employment, access to credit and infrastructure, and representation in public programs. The committee submitted its findings to Parliament in 2006, which revealed that the socio-economic conditions of Muslims in India were actually lower than those of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. This is significant because scheduled castes were those communities who were marginalized and discriminated against through India's long-standing caste system. Yet in terms of education, for example, Muslims in India were further disadvantaged due to the already existing low levels and quality of education in the country. Only 17% of Muslims above the age of 17 have finished high school, while the percentage for all other communities is 26%. In top universities and colleges in India, only 4% of undergraduate students and 2% of postgraduate students are Muslim. The data from 2011 Indian government census also shows that Muslims, along with scheduled tribes, have low representation in higher education. We can understand these declines easier when considering that between 1881 and 1931, Muslims in India actually had higher literacy rates compared to other communities, including proficiency in the English language. Indian Muslims are also the largest non-working population in the country, while also not having access to loans or credits from banks. This is because of a practice known as redlining that primarily targeted minority communities such as African Americans, in which financial services such as loans or insurances were systematically denied or limited to certain neighborhoods or communities. The ACR report showed similarities between the exclusionary practices faced by Muslims in accessing banking services and the redlining practices in the US against African Americans on the same. These reports also showed that Muslim-dominated villages are often left out of electrification initiatives and do not have electricity compared to the national average and other communities. So a Muslim in India, at the age of 17 to 25, could be deprived of their education, healthcare, employment, basic needs such as electricity, and any type of support from banks. These factors will of course put any group into extreme poverty with terrible living and health conditions. So naturally, Muslims are also more likely to suffer from poor health or die younger. In fact, Muslims make up 24.9% of the total number of beggars, despite being 14.23% of the national population of India. This means that every fourth person categorized as a beggar in India is Muslim. They're in such a condition because they are structurally marginalized. How is it structural in nature? Let's take the unemployment rates. Despite being the largest employers in India, Muslims comprise only 4.9% of government services and 7.2% of public sector undertakings. The situation is worse in administrative and bureaucratic services, where Muslim representation drops to 3%. Similarly, in the police force, Muslims account for just 4.07%, while within the Indian Army, they constitute 2%, that is 28,000 in the 1.4 million Indian Army. In response to this, now openly available data on the socioeconomic conditions of Muslims, several committees, including the Rangnath Mishra Commission, presented their reports to Parliament in 2009 and 2014, and then later published their findings. These committees were tasked with identifying the barriers faced by linguistic and religious minorities, particularly Muslims, and proposing measures to address these challenges. The reports, along with input from policy experts, recommended various policy directives and constitutional amendments to alleviate the situation. Among the key recommendations put forth by these committees were the implementation of reservations for Muslims in different sectors, such as education, government employment, housing, and improved access to healthcare and development opportunities. However, despite these researches and recommendations provided by these committees, none of the proposed measures have been implemented so far. This lack of action on these vital recommendations shows us that socioeconomic challenges faced by Muslim communities have not been addressed by any government, neither the Congress nor the BJP party. Instead, the failure to implement these directives only perpetuated the existing inequalities. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Southern Insights brought to you by Tenween English. Make sure to read the description below that has our list of references, and see you next time.